I had no notes of any substantive changes. Anyone here with any recollection of any substantive changes offered by the board
For BDD.
for BDD? Okay. Dr. Postaway, soon you've had an opportunity to review as well regarding the superintendent side of the board superintendent relationship of policy BDD. Anything you wish to offer, concerns, questions?
I think it's very strong. I think it's very strong. The only question I have is the second item under the superintendent's responsibility is recommend sound policy and enforce the policies by establishing rules and regulations. I think at some point we need to clear up administrative regulations come to the board for approval, and so those are really board regulations.
Mm-hmm.
And there are times when we establish administrative regulations or administrative rules, such as the clear bag policy, which we did not bring to the board for approval because another policy would have almost required us to take every possible step to ensure safety and security. So it's not a big deal, but at some point I think we need, maybe this is establishing rules, period. But I think the regulations part is a little confusing as long as what we're calling administrative regulations come to the board for approval. Those are really the board's regulations to implement your policy. Mm-hmm. It's a fine point, but I think it's an important point because you saw the emails, there was a lot of confusion over who implemented the clear back policy. Sure. And I didn't mind owning that, but we unfortunately referred to it as a policy, which was confusing to people.
Sure. It would be more like a rule.
I think just rules, because the board approves the regulations. And as I said, it is a fine point, the kind of thing that probably wouldn't bother anybody else. I'm just trying to be a stickler for detail. Well,
and certainly, to that point, the creation of this ad hoc committee was to honestly dive down into the finer text of it to get at the 3-foot level as opposed to the 30,000-foot level. And so we have certainly had debate about A's and D's and thans, within this committee before we took it to the board. So, certainly I believe this would be the time to address it. Again, it is coming for second reading, and so the board will discuss, and we can certainly adjust as the board sees fit. But your recommendation would be to recommend sound policy and enforce the policies by establishing rules, period?
Yes, or as necessary, just something like that. But I just think my sense from this board is you would not want to give up the right to review regulations.
Sure.
And so I just think we need to be clear right here. You're not giving that authority to the superintendent. You are talking about establishing the rules as appropriate or necessary, whatever. It could just be rules, period. That's
gotcha. That's a good point. That's a very good point. Thank you. So we will take that forth. Tracy, if you'll make notice of that, we will take that forth as a recommendation regarding the second point of the superintendent, and we'll take that before the board for second reading. Anything else you see in BDD?
No.
Very good.
I thought it was really strong policy, clear.
So Dr. Guyton, would you like to read that one then? We're going to take off regulations, correct?
Correct. So it'll recommend sound policy and enforce the policies by establishing rules, period.
Yeah. So,
regulations tend to, I guess to your point, regulations tend to point towards administrative rules as a board approved administrative rules.
right. Well, your next policy talks about the board policy for reviewing administrative rules. So I don't care which you call it, but we either have the right to set regulations or we have the right to set rules. And it seems as though the board ought to be setting regulations and we ought to be setting rules to implement those regulations.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Very good.
So that's my comment on the policy you're getting ready to take up next. It talks about rules. I just think the language could be consistent.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So we will make notice of that and discuss that at the next reading of this. Moving on to your point, policy BG, BGD, and the administrative rule that follows. I did receive one feedback regarding the policy. We're going to be,
BGD.
yes, and give me one second. Okay, so review of administrative rules. So if you look at your second heading on page 1 of BG, you will see in the second paragraph, the board will approve administrative rules when such approval is required by law or otherwise advisable. The superintendent will have freedom, however, to amend or issue additional rules and procedures consistent with board policies. The recommendation is that that language be changed to, upon recommendation from the superintendent, the board will amend or issue additional rules and procedures.
So going back to the policy, well, to the, to BDD that we just looked at, and we took out regulations and left rules underneath the role of the superintendent, the things the superintendent will do. I do think we need to look back at that particular section.
Right.
Because
Maybe since this whole policy is written around rules, you let the administration set some regulations. Either way, it just needs to be consistent.
Right, exactly. So currently it says the superintendent will have freedom, however, to amend or issue additional rules, which we did state above that the superintendent can issue those rules. And it says, and procedures consistent with board policy. I mean, is that redundant since it's already stated above? They will recommend sound policy and enforce the policies by establishing rules is under the role of the superintendent. I guess it doesn't hurt to have it said again, but this section is under. The board will approve administrative rules when such approval is required by law or otherwise advisable. So you're saying not change that sentence, but change the next sentence? What's the recommendation?
So the recommendation is, upon recommendation from the superintendent, the board will amend or issue additional rules and procedures.
Oh, so this is saying instead of the superintendent will have the freedom, however.
Correct, so
It's
that,
saying the superintendent will make recommendations and the board will essentially amend or issue the additional rules and procedures.
so the second paragraph, the recommended second paragraph is the board will approve administrative rules when such approval is required by law or otherwise advisable. Upon recommendation from the superintendent, the board will amend or issue additional rules and procedures. And that completes the second paragraph.
Okay, so I. I don't think that we can do that and keep what we just put in the other policy.
I would agree. And I guess some of it is the semantics that we're accustomed to saying administrative rules. So those two things kind of go hand in hand. And then, and so the broader question there is, who should set the administrative rules? Should it be the board or should it be the superintendent to carry out the policy of the board? So, you know, that's sort of the brass tacks of it all. So, you know, certainly I think some conversation surrounding that would be helpful. Because I think regardless, to maintain consistency, you're going to have to choose one or the other. You're either going to have to choose rules or regulations. I think we're all in universal agreement that, you know, as a essentially appointed CEO of the district by the board, the superintendent must have some flexibility in there to run the district, all the while maintaining and staying under board policy. No different than any other organization or school district across the country. So really, that's kind of the brass tacks question is, where does one stop and the other begin?
And that's where you draw the line, just being clear where that line is. A good example that I could offer right now is the dress code policy. The board has a dress code policy, and you have rules that go with it. And so not all schools are enforcing it. And you need only walk through any one school, pick any, and you'll see that it's not being enforced. If we have a policy, we need to enforce it until the policy is changed. So I need to tell the principals when we meet, this is what's going to happen if you don't enforce the rules. So is that a rule? Is that a regulation?
Right.
Or is that an administrative directive? It's somebody needs to have the authority to say, if you don't abide by the board policy, here's what's going to happen. And because you're dealing with students who've already bought clothes for the year, we'll give you until this point in time to change the practice in your school. But you've allowed the school year to get underway clearly outside of the current board policy. So one of two things can happen. We can lobby to recommend to change the policy, or we can enforce it. And here's how we plan to enforce it. You're going to get a letter of warning the first time. You're going to get a formal written reprimand the second time we see it. And the third time, there will be more serious consequence. I don't know, I'm making all this up. But that just, where's the line? Do I have to come back to the board to say, now here's the rule I'm setting to implement this policy? We can do it any way you want. You all only meet once a month, so anything that happens in between one meeting and another, I've got to wait to come back and say, Mother, may I?
Right, and we
Right.
have to be careful not to tie the superintendent's
Correct.
hands
Yep.
in managing our
I think
schools.
the terminology that comes to my mind is operational procedures consistent with board policy. Because I really think that's kind of what you're hitting at, is that there's an overarching umbrella covering board policy that stipulates if we have concern about dress code, for example, this is the board policy as it exists today. Then what I think you're getting at is sort of a tiered level of accountability. So if it's not being enforced at the local school level, well, that's not ours to enforce.
No, that's
Quite
why
frankly,
you
that's
hire us.
yours to enforce. And then, so it becomes a tiered accountability at that point, until which time, Plan B is offered. And certainly the board is more than happy to address and look at, the changing of the times or whatever it may be. But as it sits today, this is the board policy, and these are the operational procedures that are conducted by the administrative team.
Right. And I don't have any, for some future board and some future superintendent, these two policies need to be more carefully aligned. I understand well what happens when a board gives a superintendent too much authority. You don't want to do that.
Sure.
By the same token, particularly because this board meets once a month, you want the superintendent to have the ability to implement your policies by setting some, now you fill in the blank about what that is. A procedure, a rule, a guideline. It's not a guideline, it's more than that. It's a requirement. I like the way you worded it for policy BDD, the sound policy and enforce the policies by establishing, you said something about procedural operations to enforce the policies or something. I'm not sure what words you used. It's just those two things that right now seem benign.
Right.
But one could see, I mean, the person who made the suggestion to you, the board member who made the suggestion, board member or plural,
Right.
who made the suggestion are clearly concerned that the superintendent might be the dish that ran away with the spoon.
Sure.
You know?
Sure. Yeah, and so that's always I guess that's why we exist as this committee, is to try to iron out the rubs. And sort of from day one, just to kind of give you a little historical context, from day one, we have made it very intentional to divorce ourselves from being the current board, being the current superintendent. That, we're making these recommendations for the board 10 years from now, the board 20 years from now. And
Right.
so
Right.
that's the way in which we have operated. So, I would offer that on BDD, that we change that to say recommend sound policy and enforce board policy board policies by establishing operational, pick the word. As you said, guidelines seems a little lacking. You probably want to stay away from rules, because that is confusing with administrative rule.
What about regulations? If we use the word regulations here, since you have administrative rules that are the boards, how about regulations here? Until a thesaurus gives us a better idea.
And
Thank you.
And I think in addition to that, where's the hair on it? This BG that we were looking at with the recommendation that was given to you, maybe it's the freedom word in there that's causing a little concern. What if we said something to the line of, the superintendent will have the responsibility to issue rules and procedures consistent with the board policy? Because, that's really what we're charging him or her with is, we have these policies that have been set forth, and then in order to manage and run the district, this person has the responsibility to issue additional rules and procedures, whatever, consistent with board policies to run the district.
Yeah, I think the important thing, I never like to, if it's already been stated once, why restate it again?
Right.
And so it's clearly been stated in BDD, the responsibilities. This, however, is specific to the review of administrative rules. And so the board will approve administrative rules when such approval is required by law or otherwise advisable. What more is needed, if anything?
To add to BG?
Correct.
If
I mean,
we
you certainly have the
changed it-
you have the next one below. The board may nullify any administrative rules determined to be inconsistent with the policies adopted by the board.
Right.
Um,
So basically changing it to regulations in the one above and keeping this as rules and procedures. Is that right? What we landed on?
So you could, well, at that point, it becomes some level of consistency, because it seems like you're leaving an open door. If you open the door and the superintendent will do the following: recommend sound policy, and enforce the policies by establishing rules and regulations, and then you have the board will approve administrative rules when such approval is required by law or otherwise advisable. Well, who's advising is gonna be the question. So I guess the big question to answer is, does the board need to set administrative rules or not? I would say historically, that is what we have done, as it is part of our codified board policy. And so historically, that has been the action of the board. And so I don't know if there's any significant reason to change that way of operating. Let me ask you as superintendent, does that stand in the way, having an administrative rule, bringing an administrative rule to the board for review, does that stand in the way of your ability to conduct your job?
If the rule further clarifies how the board wants the policy implemented, to me, it isn't really administrative rule, it's further guidance from the board. I've not ever seen administrative rules or regulations brought to the board for approval, but I can tell you, there's been many a time I wish the board had approved it, because you're standing out there all by yourself on your interpretation of the policy. And in my experience, you're doing exactly what the board wanted you to do until people don't like it. And then you're kind of out there like the football coach with 3 seconds left on the clock. Your team has the ball, and you turn around and you're the only one there down at the 3-yard line with them. So I don't have any problem whatsoever having the board develop administrative rules if they're to help implement a policy. I think that second paragraph is, it conflicts with itself. I think it needs to be stronger. The board here has a history of approving administrative rules. I think to change that would signal to the public that you're giving more authority to the superintendent than either the board or public may be comfortable with. So I think the board will approve administrative rules, period. And then if you've approved it, the superintendent shouldn't have the freedom to amend it. The superintendent reports to the board. And so I just think if you just need to take a stand one way or the other, you want to approve the administrative rules, because you've given the superintendent the opportunity to establish regulations
Yes.
that are further needed in order to work those rules down to the ground level.
Yeah, I think that's simple and straightforward. I mean, goodness.
How about the board will approve, amend, or nullify administrative rules upon recommendation from the superintendent?
Instead of saying will, but may.
Upon what, did you say again?
The board will, essentially what I'm doing is I'm condensing all of those, approve, amend, or nullify into one sentence. The board will approve, amend, or nullify administrative rules upon recommendation from the superintendent.
Should we say may instead of will? Because if we say, yeah, because if we say we
There
will,
needs to be a choice there.
yeah.
I agree.
Right,
You may not want to.
right.
We may want to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
So the board may approve, amend, or nullify administrative rules upon recommendation from the superintendent.
Sounds good to me.
And to your point, to my knowledge, we still have policy C and B in place. In cases when action must be taken within the school system where the board has provided no guides for administrative action, the superintendent shall have the power to act. His or her decisions, however, shall be subject to review by the board at its next regular meeting. It shall be the duty of the superintendent to inform the board promptly of such action and of the need for policy. So there's freedom and there's coverage all at the same time.
One if by land and two by sea.
Well, and, you know, I've kind of always said that you usually end up on an island for one of two reasons. Either somebody puts you there or you put yourself there. And it's never comfortable to be alone on an island by yourself. Obviously, we want to minimize the putting of someone on an island. We don't want somebody to have to, exist on an island by themselves. We need to have policies that align the board and the superintendent. So are we okay with this language? The board may approve, amend, or nullify administrative rules upon recommendation from the superintendent. And that would eliminate all other sentences through the board may nullify any administrative rules. You got that, Tracy? Okay.
And just to clarify, it goes without saying, the board can change your policies at any time.
Sure.
And the rules, so it's not saying you can only change them.
Right.
Right,
When the superintendent
Correct.
provides it for.
okay.
Right.
And then, Dr. Guyton, can we go back to BDD then? And we're
Yeah.
going to alter that sentence as well.
Yes, so if we go back to BDD, then the conversation surrounded recommend sound policy and enforce board policies by establishing operational regulations. Are we good with that? Does that seem consistent with BDD to cross over to BG? Okay. All right. What else do we have regarding?
And I think there's BGDR, right?
Correct.
So, yeah, go ahead.
After you, I'm excited to hear what you got to say.
No, good right now.
All right, so this is looking at essentially policy process and review. So sort of the outline of that would be there's a proposed policy revision at least 30 days prior to the approval, which would be presented to the board. If there's legal concerns, assuming that has likely already been handled, but assuming if there were additional legal concerns, the board would have essentially 30 days to seek legal counsel. And then we changed it to say, instead of first reading, a policy introduction that the superintendent will make to the board, and then it becomes readily available to the public for review. And then, of course, we go through the readings, we come to a final approval. If necessary, the superintendent will distribute a copy of the policy to each building administrator. And then we have the updating of that it will be updated within 60 calendar days to the website. So questions, concerns? There is one recommendation received.
Well, I think the 60 calendar days was after something is proposed to us that we would make a decision on it.
Oh, correct, you're correct. I'm sorry. That's correct.
Which means there's a couple things we need to get moving on.
Exactly. Well, now it's proposed. So this is a proposed. This is not an adopted. This is proposed. A little chaotic, Tracy. Well, we're not going to approve it. It's the board at large. So, One question regarded the last bullet point, the superintendent will supervise a review of the policy manual on a continuing basis. The district may seek the aid of South Carolina School Board Association Policy Services in performing this review. The concern was, do we narrow our scope by just singling out South Carolina School Board Association and look at expanding that to, say, legal counsel, whatever it may be, something outside of just South Carolina School Board Association?
Because legal counsel would still encompass SCSBA
Possibly,
if we choose to
if
go
we went through
them.
their legal counsel,
Right.
correct. If we sought outside legal counsel, then you may run into some inconsistency issues.
Well, we also addressed them earlier on when we say the policy manual coordinator will send the policy to SCSBA for final formatting and posting. So I guess they post all of the South Carolina school districts.
Yes, that
School
does
board
happen.
policy.
Yes, that has to
Gotcha,
happen, yeah.
okay.
Questions, concerns regarding a narrowed scope? And the other question is, on a continuing basis?
Oh, what does that mean?
Yes.
Well, this is my first round of doing this, so I'm not sure. In your experience in the past, what does a continuing basis look like for policy review?
It means that anytime you want to tie a board down and not have them really get anything else done, you ask them to review a section of the policy manual. And that will divert their attention from anything else you're trying to get accomplished, just for this reason. It's just a slow process, and it brings out every tiny worry or difference in philosophical understanding of board and administrative roles. So I've never really seen any board be successful at this. I think it's a good idea to maybe the same way we adopt a bus replacement cycle or instrument replacement cycle, to have a cycle of looking at different sections of the policy manual, maybe one per year. But it has to be ongoing, but it's arduous, and it bogs the board down. I mean, you all know, it uses your time on this, and maybe this was the most important thing to do, or maybe it wasn't, I don't know. But I'd suggest right now, we have some really important work to get done, and as we run into policies that are interfering with practice, then we can address those policies. I don't think it's bad. I'm not sure you want the superintendent supervising it, but I think maybe it's just the board will review the policy manual on a continuing basis. Period is enough, because that's always the case. You're always looking at policies here and there that are outdated, or So I don't know. I can't be of any. I'm going to be quiet now because I'm not being helpful.
I think the concern is, for example, some of our policies still date back to 1985.
Right.
And, I'm always a fan of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. But I think as we've kind of gone through this, there were likely some things that, no, they weren't necessarily broke, but they were applicable to the times of 1985.
Things change.
Exactly.
If you think about everything's changed between now and 1985.
Yeah, it's
Tremendous.
been a little bit. Been a little bit. And so I certainly think that I would not call that a continuing basis. That is most decidedly outside the framework of what would be considered a continuing basis. Now, is that the responsibility of the superintendent? Is it the responsibility of the board? Is it both? Is it, typically outside of things that didn't pertain specifically to the board itself and board governance, those recommendations have come through and those reviews have come through administration to the board for consideration, which I think is how the vast majority of boards operate. And then for the ones reserved more for just true board governance, then that should likely be held by the board and directed by the board itself. Because then you're telling somebody else how to behave.
Absolutely.
And
That's
so that's a little
absolutely
weird. So I agree, there probably does need to be some cleaning up of this language on this
For
last
the last
bullet point.
bullet.
I don't know. This one's easy for me and Tim to answer because we can tie, you know, we can.
We're not running again.
We can tie a board to an annual review, a biannual review, whatever, at least our recommendation to the board. So it's, you know, I certainly wouldn't want to overstep that. I would want to make sure that it's something that is very realistic.
I would say, okay, so we need to address it. Some just thoughts to go out there. Instead of stating that the superintendent will supervise it, supervising their board doesn't sound proper.
Right.
So I think that word needs to be changed. I think that the board should review the policy manual as needed or.
As needed is what I'm thinking.
And
Yeah, that's good.
with the collaboration or with the superintendent, some type of communication with the superintendent, because to be honest, while we have some education experience, we're not in the day-to-day managing of the district. And so I would say the board will review the policy manual as needed with the word that I can't think of, guidance, with the input, assistance, yes. Yeah, something like that with the superintendent. Does that? Collaboration, I like that word. It's a very now word in school. Collaboration.
The policy manual in collaboration. With
And the,
the superintendent.
And I was thinking as you all were talking, I don't know what the cost would be, but I think it would be interesting to find out what it would take for someone who's familiar with the South Carolina School Board's policy template to simply review our policies to see where we're outside the norm. We may have very good reason for wanting to be outside the norm, but that would be helpful as a starter. Just where are we operationally very different from other districts, particularly the 10 largest districts in the state? Would be a huge help just to get us started and help us see what we need to look at. And I know in the instructional policies there are some changes that need to be made simply because what we're doing isn't getting the results we want. And so that may or may not be a policy issue, but it would be a place to start looking. If there's something between policy and practice that's not producing the outcomes that we would hope to see for the input that we are allocating.
What about the idea of a comprehensive review that occurs on some level of an interval? I think about trying to
I like
prevent the 1985 policy from sticking around
Yeah.
until 2020.
Right.
So if you have, say, every 5 years, a comprehensive review of the policy manual will occur to ensure relevance or whatever the, whatever terminology we would want to put there. But I think about, because this is one of our main functions.
It is.
I mean, it truly is. And we, a lot of board time, if you look at the slices of the pie, a lot of our time should be dedicated towards policy review and approval, and continually fine-tuning and fine-tuning and fine-tuning and fine-tuning till we get to accomplish the things that we're instructionally after. Because I really think I mean, you're essentially providing the foundation or the framework in which that instruction model is going to occur. And so we have to have policies that reflect that.
I love that idea. What about the year after the 5-year strategic plan? The year following adoption of the 5-year strategic plan, there's a comprehensive review of board policies to ensure the policies support the outcomes that are identified in the plan. And that way, your policies supporting the plan, because you have 3 huge responsibilities. One is hiring a leader. One is shaping that strategic plan, making sure it really is strategic and it's looking out further, and establishing some really clear outcomes you want to see. And then the third is making sure your policies and your resources support the implementation of that plan as you review it. So that would make sense to me, just organized systemically, in terms of ensuring that we have the horse and cart in the right order. I don't see how it could be done the same year because of the work that it takes. Or you could do it the other way around, set the policy and have the strategic plan follow, but that doesn't seem to make sense.
I would agree. Yeah, because your strategic plan is going to address the needs of the time.
It should. I think the last time we did it, it was all instructionally focused. And because of the growth we're experiencing and the financial challenges that we're going to face, given the changes in the allocation formula and the end of the ESSER funding, we need to have a strategic plan about dealing with growth and about funding on a 5-year basis.
I do like that idea of by policy marrying the responsibilities of the board together. So if you think about it, if you think about the big 3 regarding what we do, because we all know the budget is going to occur on an annual basis, so that's a non-question. But essentially by doing that, you're marrying your policies to your strategic plan, and by your policies, you're marrying the board to the superintendent.
Right. And so it's a systemic approach that gives the board the controls that the board should have as representatives of parents and other community members.
So our next strategic plan is 2023.
It should happen as soon as you get a superintendent named for this year. That plan needs to start, and it needs to be operational for next school year.
For the 2023 school year.
In my view. Which means 24, 25, you would have a comprehensive review. There's nothing that would keep us next year, but there's nothing that would keep the district from asking SCSBA to just review those for obsolescence.
At that time, right, the reason I was
In
asking the
preparation.
timing of that is we have elections every even year. And if our review is on even years, like the 24, 25, adding the burden to probably new board members, if they aren't even familiar with policy, if they get, if they are elected and haven't
that's a good
followed
thought.
anything. So having the option to have someone just review it. I don't know. I just want us to be cautious about putting something in policy that forces a future board to do something.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
But at some point, we have to address the policies of old that,
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I think that's inherent, I believe, because laws change, everything changes, so it has to occur on a continuing basis. That's without question. It's the ones that sort of fall through the cracks that become the rubs. It's the 1985 policies that just kind of linger around. And so at some point, there does have to be a comprehensive review. Now, you're not timelining it, so you're not putting a hard stop on it and saying that comprehensive review has to occur within 3 months or 4 months or, whatever it may be. I mean, it's certainly something, but I do think unless you take a little bit of time and force yourself to look at it, because we have done that through policy. We have forced ourselves as a board to do certain things, because we know that the behavior of one board may not be the behavior of the other. And quite frankly, if the next board doesn't like it, well, they can kill it. I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah, okay, so I think we're all in agreement to not say the superintendent will supervise a review, because, let's be honest, our superintendent's sitting in here with us for 2 hours right now, when I am sure there are other things on her plate
I would agree.
that,
Well, I think anytime you say the subordinate's going to supervise the supervisor's work, it's
right,
problematic.
right. So let's take that word out for sure.
Scribes.
So how
All right,
about,
what you got?
how about this? A comprehensive review of the policy manual will be conducted by the board in collaboration with the superintendent I'm gonna throw this one out there, shoot it down if you want. The year following completion of the strategic plan
Or implementation of
or
the strategic.
implementation
Now, that's every 5 years.
of the strategic plan.
And it could be 6 if you ask the state for a waiver to go to 6 years, but it's normally 5 years.
And we'll put a little caveat in there that Tim Oswald and Kyle Guyton will be the community members.
Yeah, you hold your breath.
You know, getting that good community input.
What do we think of that? A comprehensive review of the policy manual will be conducted by the board in collaboration with the superintendent a year following the implementation of this strategic plan. It almost seems like you want to say to ensure. Maybe not. Why use
Sometimes.
Why use
less
10
is-
words when 5 will work? Yeah.
Let that board make the decision of what.
I do think, I do feel very compelled that we have to force discipline upon ourselves to make sure that things just don't linger around unnoticed or unattended. I do feel pretty strongly about that. And it doesn't seem like 5 years is overly burdensome.
That's fair.
That seems fair.
Yeah, I mean, you would essentially go an entire board term without reviewing it,
Mhm.
you know?
Now, all the while, obviously, revisions are being made
Mhm.
to
Right.
Oh,
the,
absolutely.
to the
but
policies
without
as-
reviewing
yeah,
it.
but a comprehensive review.
Yeah.
Okay. Questions, concerns, thoughts?
Moving along.
Are we good with that? Tracy, you good? You want me to read that again?
Yep, so we're going
more
to eliminate that
Last
bullet
bullet.
point, and it's now going to say, a comprehensive review of the policy manual will be conducted by the board in collaboration of the superintendent the year following the implementation of the strategic plan. Are we
I like
taking out the sentence about seeking a from SESB. and
Yeah, because I
specifically-
think that's inherently set above, and
When
the South
we
Carolina School
send
Board
the policy
Association,
to
Policy
them.
Services, and other sources of policy research information. So there's
Mhm.
leeway
Like that.
there that it can be any third party essentially, that the board at that time sees fit. Okay. Next, I have deletions of BDDR administrative rule, and then I have deletions of the other board policies. I had no feedback recorded from the board at large. Anybody else receive any feedback, concerns, thoughts? Okay. And then lastly, we have BBA-R member authority and responsibilities.
CAA, yes.
Let's check our time. We
We're
do
doing
have a
great.
12:15 hard stop. Just due to some of the events of the day, to make sure that IT team is allowed to get where they need to be. So we will have a hard stop at 12:15.
All
And
right.
again, if we don't reach consensus on this, that's fine.
20 minutes is good for discussion. We can do this.
Okay. So, question here is regarding,
The items to the agenda. Isn't
Yes.
that what we're looking back
Correct.
on?
correct,
Okay, here we go.
correct.
Correct.
We had no additional feedback from the board at large, so that will go for, for second reading.
Right.
So inherently, the question here becomes, how does any board member have, or what is the process by which a request for an item be added to the agenda? And so, we have a couple options here. I mean, you see, there's a notification sent to the board chair and/or superintendent, then it's discussed, and then it either comes on the agenda or does not. Next question would be, should it be approved by the board itself? So I will open up discussion for, and I think this is the main question mark of this policy. I think all the other ones are okay. Requesting legal opinions, responding to requests from the media, and actions or complaints. I don't have any additional notes on that. The main thing centers around addition of the items to the board meeting agenda. Thoughts, questions, concerns?
I think an item should go through some process of legitimacy. I mean, if it's under the scope of what the board does and approves. I mean, we should put it through some kind of test, see if it, flushes out, before we just throw any kind of item that anybody brings.
Kathy?
One question that was sent to me from a board member regarding this, it states a board member wishing to suggest an agenda item will notify the board chair and/or the superintendent, since they're the ones who create it. But the question was asked, does the board chair have to bring his or her request to the full board if they want something on the agenda?
Has it not been a requirement in the past? It has?
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I'm nodding, listening to you. I don't know, not that I know of. But that was a question that was sent to me.
Yeah, I think, forgive me for any misunderstanding, but my understanding is that it's essentially a collaborative process between the board chair and the superintendent to set the agenda for the following meeting, whenever that meeting may occur. Has that been your experience thus far?
That's absolutely been my experience, and to my recollection, the board, no board member has asked me to place something on the agenda. One board member has expressed a desire to have more discussion about, for example, the financial reports that are given each month. That's different than asking to have an item placed on the
Sure.
agenda. In my experience, one less than a quorum of the board needs to request together. Then, in other words, 3 out of 7 board members need to agree that this item is within the purview of the board and rises to the importance of discussion by the board in public. And if that happens, they sign agreement, they outline what it is we can't frame the issue. They need to frame the issue for the board and submit it. And if the superintendent receives that by a certain deadline, so that we're not at the last minute trying to round things up for the agenda, then it goes on the agenda. And then you see, in my experience, a good deal of activity right after elections, because there are issues that people want to discuss, and then it dies down, and when people realize things might not have been as they perceived.
So this is, what we have here is what we brought to the board last time.
Correct.
So, in light of the
Now,
recommendation.
remember, this is the one that started
This
everything.
whole review, yes. This is what started the whole B policy review.
Yes.
Okay, so a couple thoughts in light of what was sent.
Mhm.
What if we change the first word where it says a board member to any board member? Because that would mean even if the board chair personally feels convicted about something that we should discuss, but maybe the superintendent doesn't feel this is a priority for our board meeting agendas, that board chairs, whatever it might be, would have to be brought as a proposed item to the board.
I certainly like the idea of any board member. I guess my thought is, I don't like the 6-day kind of thing, because quite frankly, 6 days doesn't seem, let's say I want an update on athletics. Well, that's pretty broad, and that can encompass a lot. And so the idea of me sending you a note 7 days prior and saying, hey, can we go ahead and add an agenda item for,
Well, I think the way it's written is it would be a proposed item. We would not discuss it until a following meeting. So basically, the way it is now is any board member, let's take athletics, that's an easy example.
right?
Let's say Kyle wishes to talk about athletics. So he would notify the board chair and the superintendent in writing at least 6 days prior to the meeting at which they desire the board consideration of the proposed item, is what it says. And a decision will be made whether to add that proposed item to the agenda. If the majority board members request the addition of the item, it says the proposed agenda item must be within the scope of the board's duties and appropriate for consideration.
Approval at the next board meeting.
Right, at the next
Gotcha.
board meeting.
So why could we just not tie it to the meeting itself? So if at every meeting, there is a 9.0, a 10.0, 11.0 that says, request for future agenda items.
Mhm.
And then if you
Or items for
have
board
a,
consideration, isn't that what we say at the end of our?
it is, but that's mainly just our reports and those kind of
Right.
things that we receive. This would actually have its standalone request for future agenda items. and then that would either live or die with the board decision at that time.
And it would be, well, it would be simple. Would we discuss it then, or would
Yeah.
it be more of a note for the?
Yeah, no, it would be discussed, like, hey, I'd like to have an update on athletics. Okay, why would you like to have an update on athletics? Because la-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then if 3 additional board members feel the same way, you now have a vote of 4. And so that would say, okay, for the next agenda, for the next meeting, an update on athletics will be a part of the agenda.
So, but didn't we discuss, and I could be wrong, that part of the reason of doing that 6 days in advance would allow the superintendent and his or her team time to say, hey, this much manpower would need to go into researching this, or?
Yeah, it seems like I do recall that similar conversation. It gave an idea to the, which I guess if it's, I see what you're saying.
Like if you say athletics, well, then we say, well, Bennett has to talk to 8 middle
Athletic
schools,
directors,
5 high
Right.
schools, different athletic directors. They're in the middle of the big season of sports. It's gonna be
And if I recall correctly, there was also question about if the superintendent already has plans for 2 board meetings from now, I'm gonna bring up about such and such. Can we hold it until then? I think that was some of the conversation as well. Yeah, so I mean, that certainly makes sense.
I'm gonna be really honest. This paragraph seems confusing, the way it's written to me.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's not. And I hate saying that and not immediately having a suggestion.
Okay, so any board member wishing to suggest an agenda item will notify the board chair and/or the superintendent in writing at least 6 business days prior to the meeting at which they desire the board consideration of the proposed item.
Period. And then
Period.
get rid of that, I don't know what that comma is there.
And it says, and a decision will be
Yeah,
made
get rid of
whether
and.
to add the item to the agenda. The only concern I think with that is now you're creating a filter.
Right, so the decision to add it to the agenda for consideration?
Correct.
Right, I think that's where people are getting hung up,
Mhm.
because, right, because that is then allowing,
Okay, so if you end it there, in which they desire the board consideration of the proposed item.
yeah, then take out that next sentence. The
Mhm.
proposed agenda item must be in with the scope of the board's duties and appropriate for consideration. The proposed agenda items will be placed on the agenda for approval at the next meeting. Yeah, just
Yes.
take out that
Correct.
center part. Okay, Tracy, are you here? Okay. So a board member, any board member wishing to suggest an agenda item will notify the board chair and/or the superintendent in writing at least 6 business days prior to the meeting at which they desire the board consideration of the proposed item. Skip down to the proposed agenda item must be within the scope of the board's duties and appropriate for consideration. The proposed agenda item will be placed on the agenda for approval at the next meeting. At the next meeting, during discussion of the proposed agenda item, and we could put a time limit on this so it doesn't drag on, the superintendent will provide the board with an estimate of time and staff resources that will be required to prepare for a thorough and appropriate discussion of the proposed agenda item. However, if you reach out to the superintendent and say, I want an update on athletics, and the superintendent says, yep, you know what, in 5 minutes, I can do that. It's going on the agenda. He or she has the authority to just do that, right?
The way your policy's written right now, yes.
Right.
The one modification I'd ask you, if you want to make, in the sentence you just read, the last sentence, the proposed, the last sentence on the first page, the proposed agenda item will be placed on the agenda. I don't think you mean for approval.
For consideration,
For
I think you mean-
consideration.
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, for consideration at the next meeting. At the next meeting, during discussion of the proposed agenda item, the superintendent will provide the board with an estimate of the time and staff resources that will be required to prepare for a thorough and appropriate discussion of the proposed agenda item. And then does the board vote
Yeah, I think,
once hearing the feedback?
essentially, yes. So in that scenario, that is allowing any board member to have a process by which an item can be added to the agenda with a consensus of the board.
Mhm. We have 4 minutes.
Does that seem realistic from a superintendent perspective
Mm-hmm.
regarding the timelines of essentially a week prior to the meeting to get an idea of how long it would take to prepare an item? And it may be that that preparation may say, we can't do it for this next meeting more than likely, but we can do it for the following.
Right. I think sometimes we can even speed up the timeline, as you pointed out, depending on what the item, how
Sure.
complex the item.
Right, and I think it's nice to have something like this in writing, but kind of at the end of the day, we as board members should have a good working relationship with our superintendent.
Absolutely.
And I think that if one, or especially if more than us come with the same questions or concerns, that should probably be a red light that, hey, this is something I need to address with the full board
Right.
anyway, so.
I would agree. All right. Well, I believe that concludes our discussion of these
So-
policies. Yeah, change from approval to consideration.
And are you going to vote on it?
I'm sorry?
And vote on that, it's for consideration.
Consideration,
So that sentence would read, the proposed agenda item will be placed on the agenda for consideration at the next meeting. At the next meeting, during discussion of the proposed agenda item, the superintendent will provide the board with an estimate of the time and staff resources that will be required to prepare for a thorough and appropriate discussion of the proposed agenda item.
yeah, should you put a qualifier on there? The board will
The
then
board
vote,
will then vote to add the item
for the following,
for the following meeting.
or for a future meeting.
For a future, right.
Because otherwise, you're gonna hamstring the superintendent to say you have to have this done in the next 30 days, but,
Yeah, I think the board will then vote whether to add the item.
Correct.
for a
Whether
future
to add
meeting.
the item
Correct.
for a future meeting.
correct.
So then it will say the board will then vote whether to add the item to a future meeting. Okay. Last sentence.
Okay. So I believe that concludes
12:13.
our discussions for today. Now, regarding items that are still pending, I have policy BBA as still pending, and I have policy BD as still pending. Is that correct, Tracy? Those are the only two that are essentially left on the table.
Really?
Now, that's not of all of them, but of the ones that we have reviewed. There are still more to be done. And so, as I've kind of sat and thought about this and worked through it, considering the times, considering the decisions that the board has to make within the upcoming several weeks, I believe my recommendation is going to be to the board that we hold on additional approvals at this time. The question for this committee would be whether or not we want to meet again to specifically discuss BA and BD prior to November. Because essentially, the September meeting is canceled. We're down to October and November meetings. So essentially, we're down to only 2 meetings left, and I certainly don't want to rush the committee nor the board in policy adjustments and additions or deletions. And so, you know, we've been methodical, and we said from the beginning, we hope to have it done, but there was no guarantee. And we certainly have more than a capable committee member in the form of Kathy Henson to carry on the charge to do such wonderful work.
She should be able to reach consensus pretty quickly.
So that would be the question for this committee. Do we want to continue suspension of BA and BD? Or excuse me, where was I at? BBA and BD. I think you were still getting some information regarding policy BD, if I'm correct.
And what was the other one?
BBA,
BA.
Board Powers and Duties. And that's mainly centered around visits to schools and those kind of things.
Right.
And
I do think those are important that we look at them, but I understand your timeline as well.
Well, no, I mean,
So-
I think we have time to complete those, if we want to complete those.
Those two.
And I think we could likely dovetail a committee meeting in with one of our other meetings while we're already here.
I think that would be really good.
So if there's no objections to that, Tracy and I will get together and send out some times for consideration that we can just specifically address those two. And maybe by that point, you'll have some more information regarding BD, because I think you were looking at some other school board policies across the state, and that should do it. All right, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Yes, so move.
Second,
Second.
discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? See you next time. Thank you.